to welcome all to this session of SAIL. So this is the last talk, and after which we only have the panel discussion. So over the last 5 days, we have had many reputed speakers giving excellent talks. And today it's our pleasure to have Professor Adam Wyner. So I'll just introduce him briefly, though you have heard about him quite a lot in the talk by Jack Conrad. So yeah, so Jack Conrad actually named you as one of the most influential law AI researchers in the recent times.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I'll have to. I'll send him a Christmas present.
Yeah, right.
Christmas present.
So yeah, so Adam Wyner is an associate professor of law and computer science at Swansea University, UK. And there he is the program lead on the LLM in LegalTech, which I understand actually helps lawyers or people having law degree to understand AI and computer science. So his research interests are in AI and law, natural language processing, argumentation, knowledge representation, and knowledge graphs, and several other related topics. So he has a PhD in linguistics from Cornell University and a PhD in computer science from King's College London. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. So now the stage is yours. So please share the slides and get started.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here.
So just a point, like to both to you and attendees. So there is a Q&A button below the Q&A window. So the attendees, if you have any questions, please write that Q&A in that Q&A window. So Adam, you will be able to see that. And if you want, you can answer questions in between, but otherwise we are following the protocol that at the end of your talk, we'll take questions and answers then.
Okay. So,
but you are free to take questions if you can see them at the bottom end. Yeah.
And is the Q&A in the chat? Should I leave the chat on? Is that what you mean? Because that's what I see here.
Do you see a Q&A button, a Q&A window somewhere on your screen? Q&A.
Yes, I do. Okay,
Yeah,
I see what you're saying.
That is where the questions will come up. So if you want, you can take them, but maybe it would be convenient for you if you finish your talk and then we can discuss them.
So maybe Shoptish, you can read out the Q&A, right?
Yeah, sure. So if it is at the end of the talk, then I'll read out the questions and then you can answer.
Okay. Okay, great. I can see the Q&A and I have two screens here, so I can keep one eye on the other side. That's
sure,
perfect.
But you don't have to, as in it's whatever is convenient to you. You might take questions in between or at the end. Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much. Great. Thank you so much. So yes, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this seminar. It's been excellent to collaborate with Saptarshi and Kripa over the last, I don't know, 1.5 years or 2 years. And I'm glad to see that AI in law and legal informatics has grown so much in India. And this seminar is certainly playing an important role in sharing information and making global contacts about these interesting topics. I'm obliged to make one correction to my very kind introduction, which is that I'm no longer the program director of the LegalTech LLM. That's been handed over to a colleague for administrative purposes. That's kind of helpful to me in a way, so that I'm more freed up to do some other kinds of things. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about one particular project that I'm working on, and the relationship to other kinds of work that could be done. So this is a very preliminary report, but I think it's an interesting topic area, very well worth developing further. And it's sort of a less technical project and a bit more applied. So this is one thread of the work that I do. I've prepared these slides with my colleague, who's the research associate in this small project, Tao Li, and I'll say some other words about the funders and the other participants in the project towards the end. So I want to give an overview about this COVID-19 debt advice project. The target really is to provide people who need legal aid with some kind of support and advice. I'll outline some of the reasons for this, etc. But I think that this is the kind of topic that really applies around the world to all sorts of local populations to different extents. I'm very aware, as I'll say, about issues about connectivity and what funding people have and different kinds of laws and things like that. But something like this, the shape of something like this, probably is very broadly applicable. So let's go through this. I'll give you an overview. So the context is that aside from the health impacts of the coronavirus outbreak, there has been an enormous economic impact everywhere. Economies have been getting shut down with lots of implications for that, as you can easily imagine, on businesses shutting down and reduction of trade and all these kinds of things. So this has led to
Adam, sorry to interrupt you. I have one request. Can you please make the presentation full screen? That will be good.
How about that?
I mean, I don't know. There should be a full screen button, right? Maybe slideshow. Can you click on the slideshow?
Yeah, I could do slideshow. Sometimes I worry about slideshow because it misleads things, but that's fine. How's that?
Okay, no, actually that again, maybe bringing out that thing. I just wanted you to make it full screen, but this is again kind of coming out to be on the right. I mean.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to see the thing on the right.
Exactly. So this is PowerPoint?
Yeah, this is PowerPoint.
Okay.
I find that sometimes the full screen, oh wait, there should be, let me just see if I can't just do it this way.
I think this is all right. This is all right.
Okay, no problem. If there is some issue here, then you can continue with that.
Oh, no
problem. No problem. You can continue.
Okay, so let's just go from this size here. I worry about presentation mode. It gets into these funny things about what's visible and the sequence and some things like that. But so is that good enough for people?
Yes.
Yes. I think this
okay.
Is good. This is good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So what we are finding, and I'm just going to base this on what I know in the UK, but the issues are arising really around the world, in different ways and different extents and things like that. So residents are missing payments on all sorts of bills about rent and local tax and their utilities and et cetera, right? And there are legal implications of this, which is the reason why this is relevant for discussion in the legal context and legal technologies, because people can face evictions and legal orders and disconnections from services, enforcement by law officers, losing employment, and then legal issues about how they lost employment, et cetera. And so because of the legal consequences, people have to resort to legal consultations about what they are and are not obliged to, and what they have violated, and what the consequences of those violations are, et cetera. And these consequences fall especially hard on people with lower incomes or have health conditions, which is an associated issue here. If you have a health issue, you're less able to address your debt issues and to find work. I know that globally, as I've mentioned, there are huge variations in all of terms of the income, internet access to justice, all these kinds of things. But I think that some of these underlying points would be relevant everywhere. And I'd be very interested in talking with people who are on the call about how these kinds of things may be applicable. So generic online legal advice is usually insufficient. In the UK, what you can do is you can go online and there's lots of information that's available. It's very complicated. And generally you need some kind of personalized advice, but the demand for personal advice outstrips the supply. There are millions of people in the UK alone who need legal debt advice. And these online solutions are not very helpful. And the solutions that we have, Step Change and some other kinds of companies, are essentially commercial enterprises, and they're rather limited and restrictive in terms of what they do, and they also charge a fee, right? The other aspect of it is that users should be empowered in the process to challenge the norms of the legal system about how debt management is being done for them and their existing power relations. This is the funder for this project has particular issues about how inequalities are being managed and whether people are just being subjected to the legal process without having any recourse. So the task that we're faced with is how to build in some greater capacity to provide debt advice in a way that's more flexible and also serves the clients in a less commercial manner. So the aims is we have to understand the debt advice. We're looking for some patterns and some strategies for giving this, to develop some algorithms to allow interactive and dynamic querying of the user and the legal aid provider to provide the relevant information. So what we need to do is we need to gather information from the advisors, do some client studies, and also from the clients. We need to analyze that data for some patterns, and then we need to formulate some typical debt solution scenarios. Let me just remark right here that gathering data, all of this is very problematic. So I'll have to return to this a bit later. And what we would like to do is to have a tailored interaction between the consultation tool that we have available and the user. So the user answers some questions, and based on the answers to those questions, they're led to subsequent relevant questions. And it's this kind of dynamic querying tool, an interactive questioning tool. At each stage of this consultation, the user's responses lead to subsequent questions and other relevant information. And yet the interaction should also allow a variety of the feasible aspects, that is backtracking or revision, discretionary choices both by the client and by the legal advisor, the statement of user preferences and challenges, and the positions of other agencies and creditors. And I'll return to some of these topics in a little bit. So it's not a straightforward march through a series of screens with one direction, but has to be much more complex and more flexible and adaptive than one might have seen in other circumstances. At the end of this process, the user should receive a tailored debt advice document that says, here's a proposed solution for you, as well as receiving information about the law, links to additional forms, recommended actions, this kind of thing. So it's a document that outlines for the user what the solution is and what they should do. And they can use this document either to make progress themselves, at least to be informed about their situation, or to share with some other legal advisor and to get some further personal assistance. So the aim here is that the whole initial process of doing a debt advice consultation should be streamlined and made available to people in a more accessible manner, okay? Let me also touch on this. We're not always thinking that people will have internet access themselves and go through this system themselves, answering all the questions. It may be that they have, let's say a library or a mobile, debt advisor who sits beside the client and goes through the questions with them in order to give them sort of, in situ advice. So it could be a mixed situation like that, not just leaving clients all by themselves. So we're also using a stable, well-developed framework called DocAssemble, which is currently widely used for legal aid consultations. Perhaps some of the colleagues on the call have seen this and used this. It's very convenient to use a kind of a framework like this rather than developing things from scratch. And then we also have to do some kind of evaluation with the legal advisors and the clients to see that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? Why do we need another debt advice system? Because at least if you go online in the United Kingdom, I'm assuming this is true in other parts of the world where they have these systems, there are systems that are available, oftentimes commercial systems. These systems are important to provide low-cost support in comparison to having human consultants who are very expensive in terms of resources, time and money, et cetera. We want to increase the accessibility of this kind of legal information and legal advice. But one of the things that we're concerned about is that we want to get away from the bias that oftentimes happens with the other tools. For instance, there is a very well-developed tool, Step Change, in the United Kingdom. It has a commercial aspect because it leads you through a series of screens asking for lots of information. And at the end of it, it basically says, if you want a solution, contact us, we'll mail you the solution and connect you with a legal aid provider who will take you through the subsequent process. And usually there's some money that has to be involved there. If you're in debt, money matters, and money can be inhibitory towards making further progress. The other aspect for our purposes is that the code is unavailable from these commercial providers, so we can't work with it for further research and development. And we have a lot of ideas about where to take things further. For instance, we want to integrate our tool with other agencies in a way that I'll talk about later. And we have a lot of other the feasible aspects of the process that we would like to integrate into the tool. As I mentioned, different positions and different solutions, discretionary issues, user preferences, challenges, and so on. So the available systems don't give us the kind of flexibility that we're really seeking, and don't serve this particular audience in a particularly good way. In this sense, we're very interested in public service. So it's less of a commercial enterprise and more public service, although presumably it could be used in some commercial ways. So let's just take a look quickly at what the sort of proposed solution is. I'll outline some of the screenshots that we have for the current implementation. But the simple view is that it's an online semi-automated support tool for legal advisors and for clients, either one, or they could also work together. Basically, the clients input personal data over a series of screens, and at the output, you have a proposed solution along with a summary of the data that you put in, okay? So it really documents where your problem is and what to do about it at the end. The other aspect, I don't think we included this in the slide, but it occurs to me, oftentimes people with debt problems have a lot of documents that they walk into the situation with, whether it's all of their legal documents about their living situation, or the bills that they have to pay, or the credit cards they have to pay, the bank accounts, etc. And there needs to be some integration of these documents with the analysis that we've got. So that's something that's a little bit missing from here. The wider view into a solution is a whole bunch of other stuff, most of which I've already really mentioned, right? So this is, sort of typical kind of engineering approach of trying to filter out, each stage of the process, different things that you can add on later. So we know that the personal circumstances can be very complicated. There's a lot of detail, a lot of financial records, and a lot of social relations that need to be tracked. There may be counterbalancing in terms of reasoning about the debt that you have, and also the income that you have, to understand your capability to pay off your debt. So there's a lot of, weighted reasoning. It's not entirely straightforward. Your circumstances, and this may be revised. You may suddenly get a job, or you may be fired from a job, etc. Your spouse may leave. All sorts of difficult and changes to circumstances. And then, relatedly, the solutions have to also be revised. Let's see, what else can touch on. There may be various legal actions that are being taken against a debtor. Maybe they're being evicted. Maybe they're being sued. Maybe their assets are being appropriated by the creditors, various kinds of legal actions, and the debtor needs to know how they can be protected. There's a whole dimension of negotiation with the creditors, so that basically, if you're in debt, you can go to the creditors and say, well, I can't pay you all the money that I owe you, but I can pay you a small fragment. Much to my surprise, I've been getting educated about this whole process. Apparently, creditors are often quite open to taking a very small fragment of the debt that's owed to them in order to get something rather than nothing, and also to register these kinds of payments on their books. We also have to tie the whole consultation process and the solutions to whatever is standing of the legislation and regulation. So this is also a clear tie into the law. And what's also interesting is that the legal advisor has a considerable degree of discretion about how this whole process goes. And as you might imagine, it's not easy to develop an implementation where there's a lot of discretion. So we're working on those aspects as well. So really we're going to have a partial solution between the narrow view and the larger view. We really want to get a better understanding of the issues. We want to implement a fragment of a solution here. As I will mention at the end, this is really a very small, very short-term project, so we can't possibly cover everything, but it's good to get to know what's going on and to do something, and to provide this basis for a more complete solution, which we would work on subsequently. So let me just give you a specific paper example of the kind of thing that we're looking at. So we need to gather the user particulars, we need to match that against a solution, and then you need to figure out how you're going to execute that solution. So for instance, we need to gather a lot of specific user information about their personal information, where they live, their health status is also relevant, their physical health status and their mental health status, their employment status. Let me just touch briefly on this mental health status. The UK just recently provided, legislated that debtors who have mental health conditions can have a deferment on their payments on their debts. This is very recent, apparently, and the legal aid advisors for debt are quickly having to adjust to the new circumstances, and our tool will also have to do this. What counts as a mental health condition, and how is that impacting on their ability to repay debt? You need to gather information about their household, what's their marital status, family situation, what's the housing situation, do they own a property, are they renting a property, how many children do they have, gather a whole lot of financial information about the various jobs, what kind of assets they have, including large and small things. What kind of expenses do they have? You need to cover this in some great detail. And from all of this information, their financial position, you need to calculate their disposable income. You need to find out the detailed information about the debts, what types, the number of creditors, the amounts of the debts, all of the details about the debts, and whether there are any legal actions against the debt, because some debts have a priority in the sense that there may be some legal action against the debtor with respect to that debt, whereas other ones you basically can sort of overlook for a little while. And also, what you have to get information about the client's preferences, what's important to them, and the different solutions may be keyed into their preferences. So some of these things are themselves, small projects, sub-projects. So for example, to figure out reasonable expenses, the legal aid advisors have to consult the government's information about the standards for what counts as reasonable. And what's reasonable may depend on different aspects of the client's personal conditions, such as their marital status and how many children they have, etc. Right? So for a single male, it may be very unreasonable to spend, a lot of money on holidays, right? And the legal debt advisor may say you must cut back on your, travel abroad just for holiday purposes. Whereas, for a family that has 4, they may register a lot of expenses, let's say on childcare and, things that children need, children's food, diapers, small clothes, etc. And that may count as a reasonable expense, okay? So there's quite a lot of subtlety even within some of these kinds of things about the expenses, not a straightforward calculation. So here's a short worked example. So you have a range of facts for this particular person. You have a certain amount of debt here. You have disposable income of 45 pounds per month is their disposable income. That is, their income minus their costs, right? So that's what this person says that they have left over. They have assets of 900 pounds, British pounds. Again, that's a fairly small amount of money. It wouldn't include, for instance, a car. They're not a homeowner, and this person is not a pensioner, so they're not earning that kind of income. And they can state some of their preferences. So they're not worried about the impact on their credit rating of something. Let's say they don't really want to go and get a mortgage and further credit cards. They're not working in the financial services because there's impact of being a debtor and going bankrupt, for instance, on what kinds of jobs that you can hold. If you can't be work in the banking industry, if you've been bankrupt, I believe, various conditions like that, they don't want to go to court, and they really want a cheap solution, to solve this. So there are various, factors that have to be consulted along the way. And what you do is you essentially, more or less, align the facts and the preferences that they have against whatever solutions are available, right? So we have these conditions that debt's less than £20,000. The disposable income has to be less than £50 per month. The assets have to be less than £1,000. They're not a homeowner. Their pension status is not relevant. In this particular solution that we'll see shortly, the solution will impact their credit rating. How credit worthy are they? It will limit their professional choices and their commercial activities. As I said, for financial services, there's no implications about going to court, and the solution is cheap. So this is sort of on the right side there. You can see the sort of the factors that go into consideration to decide which solution to provide. And on the left side, we have sort of the input information that we have to give. And that might lead to the conclusion that this client is clearly insolvent, and they are going to be given what's called a debt relief order. This is a particular type of debt solution. And the pros of this is that it's cheap to deploy. It writes off all of the debts after 12 months. So over a 12-month period of time, you don't make any payments. And if you meet all of the conditions and of this particular solution, after 12 months, you are debt-free and you don't go to court. So the cons about this is that you have to really be detailed and list all of the debts. If there's some debt that you forgot to list in making this proposal, then, and it's discovered in 8 months later, suddenly you find out that you have, I don't know, some credit card that you forgot to list that's £20,000 of debt, then you must pay this debt, right? So there are particular conditions placed on this solution and that you're responsible to see to. And if the circumstances change, that is, you get a new job or there's some inheritance, then the agreement might have to change. That is, this agreement is no longer applicable. So that's one example of how you go from sort of the input facts, various aspects of the consultation, some of the criteria that need to be addressed towards a solution, and some aspects of the solution. I hope that you can appreciate that this is by far not complete, right? This is a very fragmentary illustration of how the process works. And just to give you some oversight about this, there are other solutions. And I'm just going to give you this as a chart without the details, because you can imagine that each of the blank boxes there is actually going to have quite a lot more information associated with, what kind of solution it is, what kind of requirements it takes, what kind of preferences it addresses, what the advantages and disadvantages are. But along the top, we have bankruptcy, debt relief order, we've just seen individual voluntary arrangement, or administrative order, should be administrative order. These are what are called formal debt solutions. These are overseen by the financial services, I believe, and have to be managed by a debt advisor. And they place additional legal obligations on the debtor. We also have a space of informal debt solutions. These sort of are more negotiable in a sense. We have debt management plan, debt consolidation, token payment plans. Again, the requirements, advantages and disadvantages. For instance, the token payment plan may be something where the legal advisor has gotten all the information from the client and says, my suggestion is that we go to your various creditors and we say to your creditors, this client is clearly really insolvent and really is not able to make payments of more than £1 a month to pay off their debt. And they could pay £1 a month to pay off their debts for the next 5 years. Is that acceptable to you? Right? Talking to the creditors. And the creditors may well come back, and we have instances of this where they say, okay, we'll accept that. And there's a rationale why the creditors might actually accept such a deal, right? So there are formal and informal kinds of debt solutions. Okay, so now what I have to show you is just some screenshots, which I'll kind of fly through quickly, just to give you an impression of where we are with this. At this point, what we have is this implementation using this framework DocAssemble to gather, record, and to report the basic data from the client. As I've already pointed out, there's rather a lot of detailed information. So this is already a fairly complicated aspect. What we don't have yet for the implementation are all of these other really interesting things, reasoning from the data to solutions, although we're fairly close to getting that done. How the preferences of the clients play into reasoning about a solution. What are the discretionary choices that may be used by the legal aid advisor? What happens when the circumstances change, and how would you revise the analysis and the solution? And how do you incorporate user challenges into this overall process flow so that the user has the feeling that they're much more in control of the process and are not simply being served by the legal situation? This is particularly important for this group of clients because they're very vulnerable. They've already fallen into debt, and they're already showing that they're having difficulty in managing aspects of their personal situation. And you don't want them to simply have the experience of being subjected to the law of the land, but in fact to have some agency in the overall process. So you just have a series of screens where we ask particular detailed information. You can have a quick scan of what's here, but I don't think anything is very surprising. And there may be various implications that follow from giving specific information. Just as an instance, there's a box that's checked, yes, you have a mental health condition, and that should trigger some subsequent further questions about the condition, and that will feed into the overall process. We don't quite have this yet, but just to show you that there should be some dynamic interaction between the questions that are asked, the users that the client gives, and subsequent questions that are asked and information given. We have some screens about priority debts because these are the debts that need to be dealt with before non-priority debts because there could be severe legal consequences. And you see that we have mortgage, gas and electric, council tax, etc. And on the right there, you can see those question mark boxes where you provided further information should you need this. So the user will check off which ones of these that they're facing. And it's not that the client themselves says this is a priority debt, but they will say, here are the debts, and the system should come back and say, okay, this is a priority debt, which you need to deal with first, whereas this other debt that you've checked off is less important, so don't worry so much about it. There are several screens to allow the user to input all sorts of debt information, their credit cards, what the bank is, what the amounts are, the debts, etc. And at the end of this, you'll get a summary of the various debts that you have and how important some of these debts may be. Lloyd's Bank, it says that the bailiffs have been around about this. And there's a whole range of issues about whether you share liability of the debt with other people or not, whether it's only yours or other people, something like that. There's also the issue about being evicted from your home because you haven't been paying rent and whether this is shared with other people. So you see that you get asked a series of questions and then you get some kind of summary like this. We continue with other kinds of things like the income that somebody has, various questions about this, the kinds of jobs that you have. So you list them one at a time. And then you can have a summary screen about the various kinds of income that you have from these jobs. And then you have income that's not from a job. Here we have pension, but you may have some other source of income. Again, a series of screens that will allow gathering of this kind of particular information, and list this on a summary screen as well. And then, as I mentioned, non-income generating assets. So here's some deposit kind of thing, a series of screens to get. So again, what you need to know is the person's overall and detailed situation in terms of how much money they bring in and what kind of debt they're trying to pay off, right? So it's much more than paying taxes. It's even more detail in a sense than you have when you're filing your taxes, because you're providing a lot more information about your specific situation. It's difficult for people to manage this situation, but it's necessary to find an appropriate solution. And other kinds of information about expenses. And at the end, then you get this overall debt report. that has all the personal information, the debt information, various aspects about liability and whether it's an urgent debt. Then you have information about your income, various sources of income, whether it's from work or some other source, information about the assets that you've got, some stocks or some savings accounts, and then detail about the expenses. And this is a document that's produced at the end of the process that's from the colleagues that we're working with on this, say is very useful as a document that summarizes the person's overall financial situation as well as personal situation. From this information, we should then map it to particular solutions. So that's the overall direction that we're going in, and that's the current state of things right now. Okay, so as you can imagine, there are a range of additional issues, some of which I've raised, but there are some other ones I should mention at this point. So there are the regulators of the financial system and of legal aid advice and debt management have their own agenda and their own values. One of them is fairness, so that the debtor has to be treated fairly. The debtor has to provide a range of evidence supporting documents about their assets and income. And again, this is a significant task to get all those documents together. And as you might imagine, there are these enormous handbooks that are in circulation to cover these matters. Yes. I heard a voice. Did somebody want to say something? No. Okay. So there's some links to this, and I'm sure that these documents are rather complicated, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's this whole process I mentioned earlier about negotiating with the creditor, right? The people who are holding the money, who lent the money or who are due to be paid, about how much they can be paid. And this is something that the debtor is really not in a position to do. A legal aid advisor knows how to negotiate with the creditors. And so, it's a question about how we would manage this aspect of the process and a tool. I don't think that we're taking the legal aid advisor out of the loop of this process at all. It's just how to facilitate this to make it faster, easier, less expensive for everybody concerned. I should make a remark about why we're not just applying machine learning to this, because that's really a line of thinking that is widespread. There may be aspects of the process where machine learning could be deployed, but the overall aspect, it's really very far from being something where machine learning can provide a solution, because there's quite a lot of detailed information that needs to be gathered and legal rules that need to be applied to that information. And as I mentioned, various aspects of discretion that need to be applied. Now, you might imagine that if we had a vast amount of highly detailed data, that is instances where there's all this consultation data and the solution and the actual result of the solution, if we had such data, maybe we could apply some kind of machine learning techniques to create a model for debt solution. The simple response to this is we don't have that data. And I find it exceedingly unlikely that we will have that scale and complexity of data to work with. I'm saying unlikely because we have asked our colleagues who are legal debt advisors to provide us with use cases. And this is not something forthcoming. Why? I don't know, but the data is not out there as far as we know. So that's a fundamental problem. The other aspect, as the whole community around machine learning has been discussing, explainability is really essential in this process. The clients and the legal aid advisors and the legal system needs to know very detailed information about the situation and how we arrived at a solution and what the implications of the solution are. There are also these challenges about revision and the feasibility and discretion that need to be built into a tool. As well as I also mentioned earlier, there are changes in regulation. So there may be a new mental health criteria that comes into debt relief. And this is a circumstance where a machine learning model that's trained on a particular set of data may not be applicable where the circumstances of the law change. We would have to redo all of the data, and that again becomes a significant problem. So, okay, so that's where we were with this tool. I did mention one other aspect that I thought was very interesting, which is the relationship between the debt information and debt solutions and other aspects of the social service system, or what could be called also administrative justice. So the idea here is that as you gather all of this information and then you summarize it, some of those particular aspects of information need to be related to other aspects of the social legal system, okay? That information needs to be passed to those other components. I'll show you what I mean more specifically in a moment, but may need to be passed to these other components. We may need to hear responses back from those other components. The laws of those other domains of the law and the legal administrative system may be brought to bear. And so it's not simply that debt solutions are kind of self-contained atomic units of economic and legal problems, but there's a kind of a spreading activation through this network of legal agencies. So this is a very big and significant aspect of the problem. We are not treating this yet in this project, but I'm mentioning this project Artemis by a colleague of mine, and I'll mention this in a moment, who has kind of taken the issue from the other point of view, that is literally trying to map out the network of administrative justice systems and the relationships between them. And as you could imagine, you know, this whole discussion has had to kind of draw these two aspects of the system, that is finding very fine-grained, detailed information about legal economic problems and integrating them with this kind of map of the administrative justice system. So what's happening here is that we need to connect our information with other legal agencies. So a debt counselor is going to identify a range of issues that have to then be passed to other areas, other specialty areas in the administrative justice system. So you know, the debt counselor's skill in part is knowing what those issues are and how they relate to these other kinds of areas. So for example, there may be housing issues that then have to be passed on to, let's say, the council in the UK, the councils, or you know, the government systems that are providing social housing. There may be health issues that have to then be related to the health system for further consultations. There may be all sorts of social benefits that some client is entitled to or should be entitled to, you know, and that then is another area of the social legal system that needs to be addressed. There may be aspects of council tax, that is local tax, that have to be addressed, and that's a separate legal social system. So there are all of these bubbles. This is not the final list, obviously, it's just to give you a flavor, but you know, the information has to connect to this overall system. At this point, the colleagues that I've consulted about this, there's very little connection, right? So what their work has been to provide a digital map about how you traverse across the administrative justice system in order to react to user input. That's what we're interested in. They've been working on the map of the administrative justice system, and we've been working on this specific area of debt advice and the particular information. So what they've worked on is to provide a resource to understand the administrative justice system, specifically in Wales, not throughout the United Kingdom, but in Wales as a sub-administrative justice system, to map out the pathways between these different agencies. They have designed this tool. This is the reference that you have there, Public Administration and Adjust Wales. The lead here is Dr. Sarah Nason, and her colleagues there have worked on this, and I've given you a link. This is a very elaborate and rich and very interesting document specifically about public administration and justice, serving justice in Wales. So they have used their system to train frontline officials about the decisions within this administrative justice system and social welfare contexts. And they've developed an interactive tool where you can kind of traverse the administrative justice system and get further information about where you should go. So you describe some kind of issue. This is not online, but this is a tool that they've got available. Sort of a few screenshots that they made available to for this presentation about this tool that they've got. So you put in some issue about exclusion. Here, this may be something about exclusion from a school, and then you want to find out what agencies are dealing with this kind of issue. You are keyed into one particular part of the system. That is, you have to talk to the head teachers because this learner has been excluded from school, and you can see that there are some blanks here that need to be filled in. So it's it's more of a design tool at this point than something that's been filled in with a lot of the detail. There's an initial component where further information has to be tied into particular schools. And then if this issue is going to be made permanent, that is, the learner has been permanently excluded, then there has to be some opportunity to make a representation to the governors of the school. So this is one choice that the client might have. And if they don't want to make representations, they may be able to take another option. So you're being led towards, a discussion with the governors of the school. Depending on your choice there, you're led to a further screen. If you're going to make representations, you have the information from the head teachers, and you might want to challenge the particular comments that they made, and you have links to further information. Depending on how far this goes, right, how far the complaint goes, this may be taken to an administrative court where there's going to be a review of the legality of the decision that was made. Then that may be taken on to some further components. So this is a small fragment of a much more complex system that they've got. The point here is that the different subsections of the overall process have to be are interrelated here, depending on what the properties are and what the relations are. And for an individual, let's say a parent who's received one of these exclusion orders, this is a very complicated network to even have to understand, right? So even a map like this, it's hard for the client, let's say a parent, to understand. It's also difficult for some advisor to know how to navigate through the process because they need to have this overall sort of map of a solution. So this is what they've developed so far, and the aim is to take this further. And as I've said, the discussions that I'm having with them now is how can we integrate the very particular information that we gather with these more complex networks of components of the administrative justice system. So that's what we have sort of made progress with so far. I need to say some things about project details, and then I will wrap it up. So this is a project funded through the Not Equal Network, and Clara Cervello is the PI, and it's intended, I just want to focus on digital technology to support social justice and a path to develop inclusive digital technology in a fair future. So that's the reason why the social justice aspect is so important for this. And as you can see, it's a fairly small budget for a fairly small amount of time. So that's within the scope of limitations that we've got. We've got another 2.5 months left on it. We'll see how far we can go. We have several collaborators. I have a co-investigator, Professor Richard Owen, and then 3 separate legal aid advisors to help us understand, the particular details. And these have been very interesting conversations to understand basically how they think about things. As I'm sure you understand, when you work with lawyers, they have a lot of tacit, implicit knowledge of how to do things, not only explicit information about the law in the books, but how to do things. And for us to make progress, it's essential to understand, how to do things, all these discretionary choices that are that they're able to make. And we also have an advisory board to give us some feedback about the social justice issues, about how we're presenting information and the questions that users may have about how they're being addressed and the choices they may want to make. And as I mentioned, so the project is rather limited in scope, but it has really a rather large ambition And what we've found when we started to touch this issue is just how deep and how far it goes. So there's lots of work for many people to do. And thank you very much for this chance to present to you about this project and our progress. And I'm very open and interested in your questions. Thanks very much. So I'll turn it over to the host. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen, or how do you want me to do this now?
No, it's fine. So thanks, Adam, for the great talk. So I see a question from Ivan. Yeah. So yeah, he seems to know you too. So yeah, and basically his question is kind of continuing what you just said. So it's a very ambitious project, but the complexity strikes him. To which extent is that actionable and solvable by automation?
Yeah.
Even in the narrow view.
Yeah, so it's a great question. We're really at the process of scoping and requirements engineering at this point, right? Because to build a system, you need to understand what the issues are. We are going to, for this very small project, it's really a simple prototype to touch on the issues and to understand them. We think that we can make some instances of solutions for some particular instances, because, for instance, we can gather lots of specific information and we can tie specific classes of information, the information from users to specific solutions. We'd like to, so I think we can do that. The docassemble sort of helps with doing that fairly simple task to some extent. We then need to start to add in these issues about preferences and discretion, so that there are moments in the consultation where the client gets to ask a question and sort of redirect the path of the consultation. And the same thing for the legal aid advisor will be able to sort of enter in some discretionary points and say, well, let's just adjust the numbers that we're looking at here, or adjust the choices that we're making to account for that. So I think that we can get that far for some limited cases that we're working with. And it's more, a proof of concept kind of exercise for our particular point here than it is to provide the overall, scope of the problem. It's also, the more we understand about what needs to be done here, the better positioned we are to start to talk about how to build larger solutions and to draw in the relevant additional parties to collaborate with us. So it's more an exercise to get a prototype and an understanding to build on something larger. It's also, by the way, I think an opportunity for us to understand the domain of the problems well enough that we can, for instance, go to the government and say, that there's this overall problem. That you have the resources to address this, but it's all in paper form. How can we start to transform the paper versions of the information that you have into some machine readable form, so that we can start to build towards overall solutions that integrate, all these kinds of structures of information? This is a long range, idea, but governments are increasingly moving in this direction. And so this gives us some ideas about how we might want to do this. I mean, the technological, dimension here is to build a large knowledge graph that also has some process modeling in it, right? So that would be the big pitch, but getting a little bit of this done would be, attractive. I know that doesn't, thank you for the good wishes. Yes, we need all the good wishes that we can get.
Great. And maybe just one small question from my side, Adam. So,
sure.
So you said that you specifically wanted to avoid machine learning. And one reason definitely being the explainability issue. So I can understand the concern with, say, modern day neural models, which are not very explainable. But then have you thought of even using like the traditional machine learning techniques like decision trees and all, or even those do you think are not suitable here?
So, we haven't, at this phase, the most important thing for us is to understand the structure of information that we need to get and to figure out how to gather it.
Sure.
Okay. I think once we have a sense about that, then there will be a golden opportunity to have a consultation with machine learning experts. I'm not an expert, I'm a user, you know that. I mean, I'm a person, I can collaborate with the experts, but I'm not the, So then we sit down with real, machine learning experts and we say, this is the data that we've got. These are the kinds of things that need to be done in this overall consultation process. And what would you select as a suitable solution? So there may be points in the process where machine learning is particularly useful to yield some classification exercises or something like that. And there may be other areas where it's out of scope because we have process intrinsically involved in this, right? Now, you mentioned decision trees. Yes, I mean, to a great extent, we are designing a decision tree. We're not yet at the point of taking the data and inferring a decision tree off of that, because we don't have the data, right, to do that. We're in effect building a decision tree, right? Or we're building a tool that does the classification, but we're still struggling with what kind of data and what are the relationships between the input data and the solutions that we want to select. The caveat there is that most decision tree structures that I'm familiar with are kind of linear, right? I mean, you sort of have branching alternatives, right, that you can select, but there aren't options to kind of go back and iterate over the structure or traverse over the structure from one node to the next, right? Because it's a decision tree. And I think that we need that for these issues about preferences and discretion and the process of gathering information where later information leads you to revise a possible solution, basically backtracking, over the decision tree and go back to some earlier solution. So we're still trying to figure out what we need. And then we would come back to machine learning. I didn't entirely shut out machine learning. I just said at this particular moment, it's hard to see how that may be particularly useful.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it might require some more like some new models to be developed even, but that stage might come later. Yeah, sure. Okay, great. Thanks. So I don't see any more questions. Thanks again for the talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So I'll close this session, but